Typically 45,
So
right?
really interesting.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure there are some even basic. And I'm very happy even if the sort of there's no direct immediate connection.
It's a little structured name.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Our last speaker for the morning and the last long talk of the day before all the short talks in the afternoon is Laura Balzano from the University of Michigan. She's going to be talking about some work in active clustering with subspaces. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Thank you so much for the invitation. This has been a really educational week. I am new to active learning, and so I've really enjoyed hearing all the different perspectives. I'm going to talk about work that is mostly due to my student, John, who's here. And so you can, of course, direct questions to both of us at any time. And it's on active clustering with union of subspace structure, which I will get into each one of those topics. So, of course, everyone this whole week has talked about all the different motivations for active learning, where really the central philosophy is one that's been around for centuries, where we look for a measurement we can take that the difference between our prediction and what we're going to observe is maybe has enough uncertainty that we can learn something by training our measurements in that area. Okay, so we've heard about applications this week that use Amazon Mechanical Turk users to label uncertain images that make biological experiments for certain drugs or genes that we have some uncertainty about, and then work that I've done also with my student John in actively sampling environmental spatial signals and trying to train our robot to go to areas where there's uncertainty in the signal. Okay. But not only do we have to focus on this uncertainty, but we need to make some assumptions, as Arthi just said and many other people have said, about what's the kind of structure or smoothness or underlying the data. Okay, so maybe in clustering, we're assuming that the data are kind of cohesive within certain classes, or maybe if data aren't that cohesive, at least their labels seem to transition smoothly across space, at least after some kind of transformation. In this spatial sampling signal or sampling application, maybe we assume that there's some smoothness across space in the phenomenon we're interested in. Well, today, the kind of structure that I'm going to focus on is called the union of subspace structure, where we assume that different points from different classes of data lie very close to low-dimensional subspaces. Okay? And we'll get in a little later to what the sort of different challenges of this model are, but it definitely happens to fit a lot of data sets that these other kinds of assumptions don't typically fit. Okay? So I want to start by telling you a little bit about me and my research. So I have only started working on active learning in the past few years since John joined my group and was very excited about active learning. I had learned a little bit by osmosis from some of my colleagues before that, but my main focus of research is on using structure to do inference with messy data. Okay, so for example, I've worked on problems in structured single index models where we observe some data y that conditioned on an predictor variable x has a relationship that's dictated by maybe some unknown nonlinear function. Okay, so I've worked on this in the context of environmental calibration, where you have some unknown calibration function that's affecting your sensor signals, and you may assume, for example, that this matrix is low rank, and you can use that structure in order to also learn the calibration. I've worked in matrix factorization or matrix completion with streaming data. More recent work on understanding subspace structure when you have heteroscedastic data where different columns of your matrix are affected by different levels of noise, even though they all come from one low-dimensional subspace. And then I've worked in the past on estimating union of subspace structure, where different columns of your matrix come from different subspaces, but with missing entries, okay, and trying to complete such a matrix. In active learning, we got started in this area on a problem that's a spatial sampling problem, not the one I'm going to talk about today, but it's very interesting. If you're interested, I encourage you to ask us later or take a look at the paper we have on archive. We have a little boat. It swims through the lake, and we're interested in sampling certain properties of the water. For example, in some of the major lakes around Michigan, we're looking for low oxygen concentration because that's what you get algae blooms and other bad toxic events happening in the lake. And if you remember talks earlier in the week talking about taking a spatial signal like this and using some kind of binary search around a transition point, our work here was to do something like that, but to also penalize for the fact that this is a picture of Lake Erie. It's gigantic. This boat, well, he's not the one who swam on Lake Erie yet, but even if we get a bigger one, it'll only be the size of, say, a surfboard. We don't want him going to the middle of the interval to perform binary search before he learns anything about the signal, right? So we had something we call quantile search that trades off between the distance, physical distance that's traveled, and the informativeness of each sample. And this has been deployed even on sister lake, so these are actual measurements taken by this boat in that picture. So this, this work and the work I'm going to talk about today, those are my only two experiences with active learning. So I say that as not a caveat so much as an invitation. If you have questions or if there are things that you want to comment on, I'm very excited to hear about them and learn from all of you, because as many people have said, many of the things I'm going to do have, a lot of the foundational results were proven by people who are sitting in this room, which is really cool. So great to be a part of. And one last sort of personal thing about me and my maybe history, perhaps, is that in the last month I got married. And I don't say it just because I'm happy and excited and seeking attention or anything, but or showing off this handsome couple. But actually, just to say, I've been really busy, So if the answer to your question isn't in my slides, then I've just been busy. I'm still writing thank you notes, Just give me a break here, and I'm happy to answer whatever questions you have. Okay. So here's the outline. First, I'll tell you about the union of subspaces model, the kind of challenges we have in this model that are different from other things that are typically used, structural assumptions. And then I'm going to define something that I call subspace margin, which is somewhat analogous to margin in a classifier. Okay. Introduce our algorithm we call SUPERPAC, also inspired by the political season, subspace clustering with pairwise active constraints, and show you some results on data. Okay, so subspace representations are good for a lot of data. Okay, so how will we know if our particular data set is well represented by a linear subspace? So Perhaps you want to sense a length n vector of temperatures from a sensor network, or pixels from an image, or features from an image. Then you collect many of those signals. You have several of these length n signals. You can do a singular value decomposition and look at the best rank K or whatever rank you're interested in subspace projection of those sensors, of those signals. And when you look at the singular values, it's very, very common in every data set that I've ever looked at. It's just a question of how quickly they drop off. The singular values are large, and then there are many, many, many singular values that are nearly zero or very, very small. Okay, so our data are well approximated then by some low-dimensional subspace, maybe not exactly, of course, but with some additive noise. Okay. Now, in a lot of machine learning problems, we also need to think about a mixture of these subspaces. Okay, so image data of different objects, handwritten digits or faces, is often approximated with the low-dimensional subspace model, but different faces tend to have kind of different subspaces in the space. And so we want to think about this mixture and try to leverage that structure in these problems. So what happens when we have a mixture of subspaces? What are the kind of challenges we face? So this is just saying we have all these columns. We don't know which one maybe belongs to which subspace, but this is how the subspace might look. So if data are coming from these subspaces, the first thing we notice is that there's no separator, right? We can't even find some nonlinear function that will separate these two classes in a higher dimensional space. And so we have to deal with that fact. Another important consideration is that sometimes when you have subspaces of different sizes, one subspace like this green one may completely contain another subspace like this blue one. Okay, so the low one-dimensional subspace is a line within the higher dimensional subspace. Now, still, you might want to learn from this data if there are a lot of data clustered around this line and then other data kind of spread throughout that subspace. You could presumably still learn those two different subspaces, right? But it's still a challenge to think one cluster is entirely contained in another. Okay? And then a last one is that when you have multiple subspaces of higher dimension, they have a non-trivial, or they could have a non-trivial intersection. Okay, sometimes they must, but they could have. And that just means that points in this subspace, even though these are quite distinct subspaces, could be arbitrarily close to the other subspace, and in fact could lie in the intersection, and you'd have to try to figure out how to distinguish those two. Okay. So these are the main challenges that arise when dealing with union of subspace data. Now, it's a sort of very natural clustering problem. We have this nice model. There have been many different algorithms to try to do this clustering in an unsupervised way for a long time. But the more recent ones actually have some very nice theory to provably recover the clusters in a variety of these configurations. Okay? Probably the most popular one is sparse subspace clustering. This one here that has had several different theoretical works taking a look at how to guarantee that you recover all the different subspaces from the clustered data. And the way sparse subspace clustering works is it leverages something we call self-expressiveness. So you take each data point individually out of the data set, and then you regress it onto the remaining data points. So you try to fit your data point to all the other ones. And using an L1 norm, you can say, well, then I'll have a very small number of other points. Say, select this one, then a very small number of these other ones will be used to describe my held out point. And what these methods, or what the theory around these methods proves, is that actually it will only select points in that L1 regression that are also from the same subspace. And so as a result, you have always points that should be clustered together will have non-zero coefficients in the L1 regression. Okay. And there are several other algorithms too with other types of guarantees in a variety of contexts. Now, what's cool is that they also work pretty well on real data, okay? So that doesn't necessarily satisfy their assumptions perfectly, but classification error for SSC on the Yale faces, which is the example I've been using in an illustration thus far, can get 8% classification error. Okay, that seems really quite good. MNIST digits are a little bit less nice for the subspace assumption, but still can get 30% classification error with all 10 digits, in the data set. So, and this is the best of the 3 algorithms on that data set. But that said, this is actually still worse than what I'm going to call the oracle union of subspaces, and let me explain what I mean by that. So let's say I take the data in retrospect, and I know before, or with the true labeled data, and I take each class, everyone that's for a certain object, every image for a certain object, and I run PCA, and I take the best rank 10 subspace that fits that cluster, right? So using the same size of subspace as these algorithms were using, I fit the best subspace to each cluster. Then I forget the labels and just use those subspaces and project the data onto each subspace and do clustering or classification according to the closest subspace. Okay, so I have the sort of oracle best subspaces, basically, and I look at how to classify the data based on those. Then it gets a lot better error, so less than 1% for the Yale faces and 7% for the MNIST digits. Okay, so actually the union of subspace model is strong. If we find the right subspaces, then we're going to do a good job. And these algorithms are doing well, but not finding the best subspaces for some reason. Okay. So this is the kind of thing we were thinking about when we started incorporating active learning into this problem. I guess there's 2 sides. One, first, can we get to what the oracle can do? And then, of course, if the oracle still has errors, there's always some points that are, at least under this model, not closest to their sort of cluster center. So we need labels in order to make sure we can classify them. Yeah?
So maybe in that statement, it seems like there is some implicit assumption going that the classification labels have some meaning in terms of these subspaces in the data, and that may or may not always be true, right? It could just be that the labels are sort of orthogonal information. And when you do the oracle approach, obviously, you are relating the two, whereas your unsupervised method never gets to see that information. So what, do you think that's always a reasonable thing to assume that the subspaces are going to be related to the classification labels?
So I'm not sure that for every data set it's a reasonable thing to say that each cluster is a different low-dimensional subspace. But that's sort of the thing I'm positing and presenting this algorithm for data like that, right? So for example, in this case, the fact that I can give you a collection of subspaces, I got them in this way of looking at the labels, but I can give you a collection of subspaces that if I just use those to cluster, I get, say, less than 1% error. So it's an excellent model for those data.
Right.
Does that answer your?
You could sort of alternatively think that when you're just letting the unsupervised version loose on the data, maybe it's picking up some other latent characteristics of the data set, which may or may not be directly expressing the label directly, but maybe you could train another kind of classifier on top of that, which will be, so maybe they're just providing a more, they might still be providing a more informative representation for learning a classifier, but may not directly isolate the label in terms of just like looking at each cluster.
Okay.
That's kind of my only
I
comment.
think, yeah, no, I think I understand, and I'd want to talk to you more about it later. But maybe if we think for now of these algorithms I mentioned as outputting not just maybe a clustering or a representation, but subspaces in particular, and sort of using those for clustering. So we're sort of comparing on that axis. Yeah.
I think that Alec's question is not about assumptions, but about definitions. I mean, we don't have a definition of correct clustering. So here you take as a definition the clustering that corresponds to the classification, as a definition of what is your correct clustering. But we don't have an accepted or unique definition of correct clustering. So it's a matter of defining what is the goal and not so much of assumptions.
Yeah. Okay, then now I understand the question a little bit better. So, the applications that I'm going to show you, in all cases, we have a correct clustering, right? We want to put all the faces of the same person or all the objects of the same type into the same cluster. But in general, if we can apply these unsupervised methods to any data set where, the actual correct labeling may be different based on different goals or different points. And so, yeah, I mean, I understand better now. Yeah.
Susanna says, so then, one approach could be that you treat it as like, can you maximize likelihood on a holdout set, where you have to make some assumption about the distribution of the data on every subspace, but you'll have a generated model from the subspace. And talk about it.
Yeah, so, and then I think in that case, what we're going to talk about today would be a little more appropriate, because we're really relying on the subspace model that the class label is tied to the subspace that it's closest to. And then a generative model would generate something like that. Any other questions? Okay, so let's just look really briefly at some plots. I come back to these later, so I'm not trying to get into detail now, but these plots are showing on the x-axis the number of pairwise constraints that we request. That's the type of label that I'll talk about later. On the y-axis, the misclassification rate. And the reason why I want to show these first is to see, okay, we have this dotted line is this oracle that I just talked about. That's the classification rate you could get with this sort of best PCA fit. And it's not, it's not 0, but it's lower than many of these other, or than the starting point of these algorithms, which is going to be the unsupervised method. And what we want is to try to use as few labels as possible in order to get down to this level and then down to 0% clustering error. Okay, so that's the goal. And which labels you select in what order has an impact on then how you can do a better job of subspace clustering your data.
So how many data points are there roughly?
Let's see, so this one, let's take, for example, has 64 images per subspace. And I don't remember exactly the size of each image, but yeah, 64 image. So this is 640 total. Okay, so we just wanted to just quickly mention, in order to motivate what we do a little bit later, we use spectral clustering within our active algorithm. And these algorithms, not in all their theoretical guarantees, but in some of them, output an affinity matrix and use spectral clustering. And so to get guarantees, they talk about how this affinity matrix has no false connections. So the only non-zero entries are where two data points should be in the same cluster, and all the other ones are 0. And so spectral clustering will work very well in that scenario. Something I think is interesting is spectral clustering also works more generally and more recently or seems to empirically, and more recently there's a lot of interesting theoretical results on regularizing spectral clustering based on sort of the sparsity structure of your measurements of the affinity matrix. And for stochastic block models, we know that as long as the spectral gap is big enough in the expected affinity matrix, then we can use this regularized version of spectral clustering to recover it. So while some of these guarantees require this nice, clean, no false connections, I believe that it shouldn't need to be quite that restrictive, that probably, and that's what we see in practice, you can have an affinity matrix that's not quite as clean, but spectral clustering will recover the cluster structure. Okay, so let's go on and talk about then how do we select which points that we're going to consider and ask the labels for. And the way that we define this notion is sort of analogous to margin in classification. So first I just wanted to comment, people have talked about different classification and clustering, active clustering techniques, and people have different ideas of when these words should be used or what they mean, right? So maybe somehow classically clustering is an unsupervised problem. We don't have any labels, we just have points. We don't have a perfect clustering. We need to minimize some some distance metric or some overall metric and find unsupervised clustering. Whereas classification, even with multiple classes, we have at least some data. We can ask for labels, and then we use those in order to maybe transduce labels across the data set or whatever it is, but we incorporate labels into classification. But I think another way that we use it sort of colloquially is that actually in clustering, the clusters are kind of cohesive, right? They have something in common, and then in between clusters, we have some disparities. And maybe in classification, more what we can hope for is just some kind of separation, but not necessarily that we get some cohesive behavior within a class, okay? So these are sort of, I think, that's why we talk about active clustering, because in my example, we have clusters of subspaces, and we can use that kind of in-class cohesiveness. We know that all of them should be kind of close to this subspace, and we leverage that to do a better job. Okay, so just to think about classifier margin for a second, if we have data that comes from perhaps two Gaussians, like I've drawn here, we could select a small number of these to label as coming from the first or the second, and find perhaps a best linear classifier given the points we've seen so far. Maybe we have a decision region that looks something like this after just seeing a few labels. Then we think of the margin as a region around the decision boundary. Okay, so the region where perhaps we have the most uncertainty. So in an active margin classifier, we would start with a larger margin because we have very few labels, and then we will sample the label for some points within that margin for some small subset, and then just using that small subset, we relearn a new classifier with a smaller margin and iterate. Okay. So our notion of subspace margin is going to be similar. We don't have separate regions of space, but we certainly have decision regions. They're discontinuous, but we know that over near this subspace, we believe the data to be in the blue cluster and here in the red cluster. And so we're going to define a similar kind of margin, which is near these decision regions, but is a kind of angular margin, I suppose. So, if you're close to this by this decision boundary by angle, then you're an uncertain point, not sure which subspace it should be assigned to, and we'll query on those points. Yeah?
I mean, the picture is when your subspaces intersect in a single point, but if you have more than two subspaces, then they may have different points of intersection, so it's not clear to me how the geometrically the definition generalizes to that case.
Yeah, so I'll show the definition next. And you can imagine that, like, say there's another subspace here. So it's looking at the region that's the most sort of in between subspaces. So the points that could be equally distant from 2. So let's say there was one line here, then this would still be the margin, but in here we would get some kind of block that would go to the 2 other corners.
Points that have the least preference to one cluster over another.
Exactly. So let's look at how that gets defined in a subspace. So we have a subspace in our collection. So this is, you can think of as like a existing posited estimate that we think these subspaces are modeling our data. It has a projection matrix, so for every point we have a distance to that subspace. It's the residual error from the point to its projection, okay? So we're going to take our margin to be 1 minus the distance to our true subspace, okay, divided by the next closest subspace. So if we're very far from the true subspace and equally far from the other one, for example, a point that's in here somewhere, then it's going to have a low margin. This term will be 1, and 1 minus that will be small. Okay, so we want to sample small margin points in this way. And I just define this term here to be mu because we're going to look at that on the next slide. So points out here will be high margin points, and points closer to the decision boundary will be low margin points. Okay? And this then would generalize to, you know, other subspaces and of other dimensions and so on. Oh yeah.
So in general, we would of course like S sub k star to be the subspace that's closest to it. But there can be points for which that's not the case.
Yeah. So, well, and also here I've sort of written it like this because I proved something about this particular mu. But you know, what we use in the algorithm is the distance to the closest divided by the distance to the second closest, because we don't only compute margin on the points we know their label. We compute it on other ones so that we can decide which ones to choose. So, is there another question? Okay, so let's see then what we can say about this definition of margin. Okay. So we have 2 d-dimensional subspaces in a larger capital D dimensional space. And I'm going to observe a noisy point and ask basically, how does this margin concentrate? Okay. So my point X is in one of the subspaces. It's in S1. And all I observe is Y, which is X corrupted with a little bit of Gaussian noise. Okay. And what this very standard concentration result shows is that the margin of that noisy point is, depends on some ratio that's very close to 1, but then affected by the residual of the true point X to the other subspace. Okay. So if that true point X is very far away from the other subspace, then we're going to have that the residual is the norm of X, right? And these are both going to be small. But on the other hand, if this term is 0, then we get something, a margin, or at least a mu that's very close to 0, and then a margin that's very small. Okay. So this sort of leads us to understand that points near the intersection of subspaces are the ones that have the low margin. They have a small residual to the other subspace. So it's near to the intersection. Okay, and that's nice because it's well known, at least from practice, that it's really the points near the intersection of these subspaces that's causing trouble for the algorithms. Okay, that when we actually run it, and even in the theoretical results have to sort of make assumptions on how close those near points can be.
But this is under a generative assumption.
Yes. Yeah, X is in the subspace. Yeah. And again, that's why I defined this with K star with the true subspace. So this is saying its closest subspace and then the next closest, the ratio of those two. Okay, so and we can see a corollary of this theorem. I want to go through it. It's a little bit more technical, but I think it's nice because it sort of displays this relationship that I'm trying to talk about, like how close should a point be near the intersection for it to have a very low margin. But to get there, I need to make sure that we're on the same page about the notion of principal angles. Excuse me. So how many of you are familiar with the principal angles between two subspaces? What the definition of that would mean? Okay, a few, but this slide is going to be useful then. Okay, so if we have two d-dimensional subspaces in any space, they share d principal angles between them. Okay, so these are drawn to be in pseudo three-dimensional space. So imagine this is two two-dimensional subspaces in three-dimensional space. In this case, the first angle is 0. So any two subspaces that have a non-trivial intersection have a 0 angle between them. Okay, so and the way that you identify it is to find the two vectors, one in the red, one in the green subspace, that have the smallest angle between them. Of course, in this case, they share an intersection, so you can find the 2 points right there in the intersection. Okay, and then to find the next angle, in this case, we only have 2, but more generally, it's a recursive definition. You remove that direction from both subspaces, look at the orthogonal vectors. So I've drawn this one is orthogonal to that one in the red subspace, and this one as orthogonal to that one in the green subspace. Okay, and then the angle between those next vectors that you have is the remaining, in this case, principal angle between the two. So let's say that's about 30 degrees. Okay. And what matters here, the reason why this is important, is because how these angles behave completely dictates how far a point in one subspace can be to the other. Right? So say, for example, the smallest angle is not 0. Say it's 90 degrees. So now we're in a much higher dimensional space, and we have fully orthogonal subspaces. Then every point in the red subspace is orthogonal to every point in the green subspace, right? No matter how you project, your residual will be the full vector. You won't ever have a representation in the other subspace. On the other hand, you can't have any point that's further away from the other subspace than your largest principal angle. You know, if these guys have the largest principal angle of 30 degrees, then no point is further than that in the two subspaces. Okay, and so these quantities really dictate what you can do, like basically how much deviation you can get in the margin. So we're going to think about, okay, we're going to fix the principal angles and then look at what the margin looks like. Okay, so let me go through this a little bit carefully, since it's the technical slide. So we have our principal angles, phi 1 to phi d. And I want you instead just to use this gamma as a plug-in. So just think of it as the angles. It's sine of the angle. So if it's 0, it's 0. If it goes up to 1. But this is kind of like each angle. So gamma 1 is the smallest angle. Gamma d is the largest one. And it's just, we have this for technicality or to be technically correct as it relates to these projections. Okay, so what we're going to do is have our point, again, generative, that's in one subspace. And this point is the one we're going to kind of control. We're going to say maybe it's close to the intersection in some way. And how I control that is I'm going to say it's residual onto the other subspace. Well, we know, I said before, it can't be, the residual onto the other subspace can't be any closer than the smallest principal angle, right? That's the closest it can be. So it's going to be at least that, so at least gamma 1, plus something that sort of moves it into the directions, toward the directions of the other principal angles. Okay, so this is the average principal angle. So we control delta, or by changing delta, we bring it closer to the intersection or further from the intersection. Okay, so if delta is 0, it's at the point that is closest to the other subspace. So that's our controlled point. And now consider another point, also in S1, okay, but this time drawn uniformly. So just drawn nicely from the subspace, the average point in the subspace. So actually x2's distance to S2 will be something like the average angle, okay? And both of them are corrupted with additive noise. So what we want to be able to say is that x1, my point that I'm controlling, if I push it close enough to the intersection, its margin will be smaller than this average random point, okay? So that's what this theorem says. The margin of that controlled point, the one that I can push toward the intersection, will be smaller than the margin of the average point with high probability. If delta is small enough, so if it's sort of close enough to the intersection, and the gap between the smallest angle and the average angle is big enough, okay? So you can imagine if the average angle, well, if all the angles are 0, for example, then all the points will have the same margin. You can't really deal with this. If, on the other hand, the smallest angle is 0 and all the rest are 90 degrees, then you kind of are close in some directions and far in others, and this margin is a really good indicator of points that are near the intersection. Okay. And the way that this delta and this gap work together, you know, how far x is from the intersection and then how far apart the angles are, is controlled by this tau parameter. So it comes up in both. And the closer or the smaller is delta, then the smaller the gap can be, and vice versa. Okay. Okay, cool. So that's the end of the theoretical results of the talk, okay? But we use it as a kind of motivator for this definition of margin that I've given, and that it finds these points near the intersection of subspaces or at the closest parts of the subspaces in order to use an active labeling technique. Yes?
So do you have to assume then that the subspaces are both bounded to be able to draw a point uniformly?
Oh, I see what you're saying. When I mean uniformly, I mean from some nice continuous distribution. Any other questions? Okay. Okay, so let's look at the algorithm that we do that uses this notion of margin, okay? So first I want to comment that we're going to use querying for pairwise constraints. We motivate this just saying, well, the users that we're asking may not know the actual labels. They may not know, for example, the names of these people or the characters in another language. But they could at least identify that they're the same person, okay? Also, the users may use different languages. So, you know, if we want to identify numbers or objects, we'd have to be able to match all the different languages together. Whereas if we just ask them, are these the same picture, then they can say yes or no, right? Okay, so here's what our algorithm does. So we have as input an affinity matrix, and I mentioned briefly earlier that we use it from an unsupervised clustering technique, so SSC or really any technique that outputs an affinity matrix. We start from that, and using spectral clustering, we get some cluster estimate. Okay, so now every point has a cluster estimate. We run PCA on those clusters. So I use this illustration to show the red and blue line won't be aligned necessarily with the red and blue points because, well, some of the points from this other subspace seem to have been clustered there, but you get some approximation, okay? So using this PCA approximation, we select the test point which has the smallest margin. And on that test point, we compare it to other objects in sets that we call certain sets, okay? So this is something else we initialized. You could say maybe you start just by querying a few random pairs, and you either ask if these two should be together, in which case you put them in a certain set, or if not, you keep querying until there's no other object like that, and then you put it in its own new certain set, okay? So we take our test point, we query against a very representative image in one of these certain sets. The representativeness is also chosen by how close it is to its subspace, okay? So if it's well approximated by its subspace, then we use it as the representative, and we put it in the cluster where it gets assigned. We impute label information into the affinity matrix. So for this particular image, we say, okay, you know, it's not clustered with these or these, it is clustered with those. And then we repeat spectral clustering. Okay. Any question about the algorithm? Okay, so let me show you how it does. Okay, so we compare it against a very similar algorithm that this was essentially inspired by, that starts with the affinity matrix and spectral clustering and then just does this process differently, doesn't assume the subspace model, but assumes an uncertainty reducing way of selecting the test point. But then all the rest of this is also the same, okay? We also compare it against our setup, but where our query technique uses the affinity matrix only. A random setup where we choose every pair at random, and then of course the oracle that I mentioned before. Okay, and this is the plot I showed earlier. And you can see that using this subspace model in all of these particular examples, the number of queries, these pairwise comparisons that we need in order to get below the union of subspace oracle and then down to 0 is much fewer than we need in this uncertainty reducing model that doesn't assume a subspace model. Yeah.
So what is the ground truth here? I mean, is it a generative model, or do you have labels and you're trying to match the classes to the labels?
That's a great question. So this here is the Yale faces data. In the images that I showed before, you have multiple faces. So the ground truth is given that they took images of the same person. And then this one here is the MNIST data set. So again, they're asked to write those, so we have ground truth. Yeah. Right. As I mentioned before, that do you want to call it multi-class classification or clustering? And the reason why I'm calling it clustering is because I'm thinking of these subspaces as giving it that kind of cohesiveness. But it's absolutely multi-class classification too. Yeah.
So to follow up on that question, so your pairwise judgment, those are simulated, right? From ground truth labels.
Yeah, and cleanly.
So I guess the question I have is, consider some of the low margin points. Presumably, from your picture, some of them are going to be right at the intersection or very close to it. what would they look like in reality, right? Would it just be like a blackish image?
Right. Yeah, no, and you do see, like in this data set, these are better examples. There are some where they turned the light down very low, and that's why we kind of get those points near the zero intersection. So that's a great question. I think, and we haven't done it, we've thought about it loosely, but we haven't done it yet. It would be very interesting to instead, well, either have real people doing those pairwise queries, or have some kind of noise model where the closer it gets to that, let's say some true margin or to some true intersection, the noisier the label is.
Because by definition, the point right at the intersection can belong to both subspace, so humans have no way to tell them apart.
Right, no, that's absolutely right. So it's a really important caveat to make in this, yeah, that when we run these, we have a computer that knows the label even though there may be two black images.
So just out of curiosity, for the MEES, what dimension did you use in the subspace? That's
a good question. All of them were between 5 and 12. Do you remember for MNIST? Not off the top of your head.
That's actually,
yeah.
I just wondering
that's
the
enough.
Magnitude.
Yeah, all of them were between 5 and 12, yeah. Or 15. One of them was 15. Any other questions? Okay, so this table is just to kind of show you how our algorithm scales with the different size. Oh, here we have the little d is the subspace dimension that we use. And we chose that typically based on previous papers that had said they used that for some reason or other, and we wanted to do a comparison. Our algorithm is slower than this uncertainty reducing algorithm when D is larger, the capital D, the full subspace dimension. And it does better when D is more moderate and the number of points is large. So we're efficient as the number of points grows much more than the other algorithms are. Okay. Here's another interesting plot. So this is another collection of digits from the United States Postal Service data set. It's a little messier, and it's a couple things to point out, I guess, that this uncertainty reducing algorithm struggles quite a bit. It's a very large data set. It's the one over here. So here was about 48 hours of running, and we just stopped there. But the other thing that's interesting is the sort of spiky behavior we're getting from spectral clustering here that we don't understand yet, except to see that for some reason one label imputation has changed the clustering significantly, but then after another label it seems to come back, right? And so we saw this also in the COIL data set. This is an object, images of different objects. We saw that kind of spikiness with fewer clusters anyway. And it was really quite simple to just implement a heuristic that looked at a sequence of resulting clusterings and picked some kind of, or ignored ones when they changed significantly and came back to something more similar. So it's pretty simple to just smooth those things out with a heuristic like that, but whether there's a deeper theoretical understanding remains to be seen.
So in terms of the sort of the imputing the label, so is the idea that the ideal affinity matrix is all zeros and ones, where one means it's the same cluster of output.
Yeah.
And so when you impute something, then
you set it either to 0 or 1. And then here are a few other experiments that came from this paper of URAS, the uncertainty reducing algorithm, just to kind of show that, well, a couple of things. First, that the SUPERPAC algorithm, whether there is subspace structure or not in these data sets, it doesn't seem to do worse, right? So it may be that this sort of subspace model is also somewhat general, okay? But then also we considered another type of querying behavior where we called it active random. So what we mean by that is that the only thing we do, we still have a feedback loop. Instead of just choosing 2 points at random to query from the whole data set, we use the feedback loop, and in the stage where we make a test query, we choose that one at random, and we choose a certain set at random to compare it to, okay? But you know, just the fact of using feedback is clearly all by itself something that's also really useful here, you know, and an interesting conclusion, I think, for this crowd, that these other techniques are trying to use some fancy uncertainty or a subspace model or whatever, but just using a feedback-driven model is doing as well in some of these data sets. Okay, so in conclusion, you know, I have, from my previous research and everything, want to just impress that low-rank signal structure helps in many problems, and in these last examples, it doesn't also seem to hurt. In a particular case of this generative subspace clustering model, our definition of subspace margin provides some kind of metric for nearness to the intersection. And as I've alluded to, we're very interested in understanding more carefully, you know, when this algorithm should work, what types of mistakes it might make, or what kind of theory we can give to it. So thank you for your attention, and I'll take any more questions.
So, you know, one thing that I think would be really interesting is to allow each class to be several subspaces. Just because that would kind of cover the manifold traces as well. If a manifold, you know, it's reasonably smooth.
Yep, you could approximate it with several low-dimensional subspaces, yeah.
And it sounds like if I just generalize quite easily.
I think it would, actually, because, you know, if we could show something about this, then the next sort of step would be that if you have the subspaces, then you would simply need some kind of metric for knowing when they go together, you know, when, and you may even be able to actively query for labels on that, when you should patch these few subspaces into one bigger cluster. But we could certainly, you know, from what we have here, learn each sort of piecewise component, and then the question would just be putting them together. Yeah.
So in those experiments, it's random, just randomly choosing pairs
Yeah.
to compare?
Yeah.
Or could it be for each item, for each point, I make random comparisons to some small, you know, so you know what I mean? Like, so I pick a point and then I don't compare them to all other points, but just some randomly chosen subset, and I do that for each point. So like I take a logarithmic number of comparisons for each point, and then try to do this spectral clustering. Like, so that I make sure I have enough, kind of some level of basic density in each, for each item. Is that
I think I understand. So definitely.
I have K clusters, right, and I picked some reasonably small number of comparisons for each item or object. I'm bound to get at least one that will be in the same cluster, and so I've kind of got that.
Something
that
like K log K or something, right? Yeah, yeah, I see what you're saying.
Would that be better than just purely random, or then it's sort of like, kind of
Yeah, it's something in between what we were trying to say of using feedback, because it wouldn't be using feedback, but it's more than just choosing totally random pairs. And maybe what you're saying is to have the goal to find must-link constraints, basically, because you can imagine if you choose pairs at random, then you find more cannot link constraints than must link. Whereas, so what active random does is instead of have, you know, some smart way of selecting the test point, it selects here randomly, but then selects which order of these to query. But so in the same way, it finds something and it finds a must link. So maybe
Yeah.
you're onto something, that it's the question of those must links, yeah.
Keep sampling until you get a connected graph
Uh-huh.
of must links,
Right, right, yeah. I guess it would be a little bit more sensitive to noise, right? You'd have to think a little harder with that, but also we don't know how robust this is. So yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
How much of this just translates to the case where your clusters are shifted subspaces to the other offset?
So like a translate affine subspace, yeah. No, it generalizes. I guess, you know, you have to do an affine projection and you have to do an affine PCA, but
I suppose different clusters are translated differently, that this can totally still handle that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you would just, instead of, you know, finding a zero mean subspace, you would look for first the mean vector of your data and then subtract it and find the low dimensional subspace. And then you would do an affine projection on that as well. Does that make sense? And margin also generalizes to that case because it's just defined. So, you know, you just have your distance be defined as the affine projection. Okay, thanks again for your attention.